So if this is your first time here, my name's Adam. I'm the lead pastor. Thank you, Chris. I was gone last week, and Scott brought the message. He's not in here. You can clap for him. He will never know that it happened. Super grateful to have him do that. So, yeah, I was in... we went to Florida. It was not a fun thing. It was a pastor thing. Pastors don't have fun. But mostly I saw the inside of a hotel conference room, not Florida. But every break, I just went outside and did this. I stood in the sun. It was good. Also, I flew Spirit Air, so you should be grateful that I made it back alive. Have you ever flown? It's super weird. I've never flown. Like, they charge for everything, like water, $5, seatbelt, $10, like it just every single thing. So, and my wife, for some reason before I left, she's like, hey, I think you're going to die. And like, I'm not even kidding. She like had this feeling. And I'm like, so on the runway, I thought, this is it. All right, Lord. Anyways, makes flying more fun when your wife tells you you're not going to make it back alive. All right, so we're jumping back into the story of Jonah today. So if this is your first time here, and we're in this series in the book of Jonah, and it is that Jonah. So to give you the recap of what's happened so far, God told Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah chooses to go in the opposite direction. He's trying to get about 3,000 miles away from where God wants him. On the boat, on the way away from where God wants him, God sends a storm. And then Jonah gets thrown overboard, and then he gets swallowed by a giant fish, and that's where we left off. So he has, for 2 weeks, he's been inside the belly of the fish. We've been waiting now to hear the rest of the story. So where we're going to pick up, he is sloshing around in the digestive fluid of this beast. It's dark, it's cold. He's probably hungry and thirsty. He's in a position in his life where there's really only one thing he can do, and that is pray. So that's exactly what he does. And if you've ever looked at Jonah, chapter 2 is, the entire chapter is a prayer. So I just want to look at not the whole thing, but a part of this prayer that he prays from the belly of the beast, starting in verse 1. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord God from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence, yet I will look once more towards your holy temple. I sank beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountain. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates lock shut forever. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the gist of the prayer. Kind of get the flavor of it from those verses. So here's my guess. If you could talk to Jonah like later in his life, I'm thinking that when he was in the belly of this fish, that was his like low point in life, right? Don't you kind of think that if you talk to him later, he would like have a hard time beating that, right? Like, oh yeah, the being in the belly of the fish and being partially digested, that was bad, but this was worse. Like, yeah, right? Like that's gotta be his low point. This is what it feels like to, like hit the basement of your life, to smack your face on the basement floor of your life. As bad as it gets. So what I want to talk to you about today is the worst moments of your life. I want to talk about your low points, your valleys, your greatest pains, your greatest sufferings in life. Sounds cheerful, doesn't it? Coming to be happy today. I'm sorry. I go to church to be encouraged. Well, there's one right over. I'm just kidding. Probably happier over there. But today is not a light sermon. This is a heavy one. This is a heavy one. And I'll be honest with you. Literally this morning when I left to come here, my wife hugged me, and I was like, I don't want to. And she goes, well, just preach another one. You have like a lot. And I was like, I do. I have like 500 on my computer. I could have just pulled up a random one and said, guess what? You guys get a microwaved sermon today. But I didn't want to preach it because, well, you'll see. It hurts to talk about this stuff. So here's the goal, though. Here's the goal. Like back when it was your birthday and you actually put candles on the cake. Do you remember that? Do you still do that? Do any adults still put candles on your cake? Do you do that? Okay, 2 of you. Awesome. So how many candles are there? Do you do like 1 candle per decade, or do you do all of them? Because I'm impressed if you do all of them. That's an investment and probably a fire hazard. But when you blow on a candle, it goes out, right? But the interesting thing is, if you've ever tried to rekindle, say, a campfire, one of the things you would do to rekindle that fire would be to blow on the fire, right? And that's a weird thing, that the same thing that puts out the candle brings the campfire back to life. The same wind that extinguishes a candle can energize the campfire. And here's the goal, and it's kind of a crazy goal for a sermon, but as a follower of Jesus, my goal is not to just survive suffering. I want to grow through it. I want to fan the flame of my faith. I don't want my faith to be extinguished when the winds of life blow through. I want my faith to get hotter and deeper. Author Nassim Taleb has a term for this kind of thing. He calls it anti-fragile. The opposite of having a fragile faith. It's not just having a resilient faith. It's not just having an enduring faith. It's a faith that gets stronger when things get hard. And that's my goal. That's how I want to live my life. If I'm a follower of Jesus, if I'm a Christian, I obviously don't want my faith to get weaker when things get hard, right? I think that's we would all probably say that. But I don't just want to get through things either. I don't want to just endure and get to the other side and go, oh, thank God that's over. What I want is for when something gets hard, when I'm in pain, when I'm suffering, for my faith to actually get stronger, for me to actually be better on the other side of it. So that's the goal. And admittedly, today we're using the story of Jonah as kind of a jumping off point. We're not going to dive into this prayer. We're just using it as hey, obviously this is a low point in Jonah's life, and then we're going to talk about low points. So actually, I'm going to jump to another Bible story real quick. So forgive me. I'm just hitting you with all kinds of stories today. Remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? If you're a church person, you remember this. It's a pretty popular one. If you're really old school church person, you remember the flannel graph with the 4 little, they stick them on there. This is the things you learned about in Sunday school class, right? If you didn't go to church, then you have no idea why I'm talking about these 3 guys with very weird names. But here's the gist of it. 3 Hebrew boys, they were commanded to bow down to this golden statue of this very egotistical king who wanted them to bow down to a statue of himself. And the consequences of not bowing down to this statue were that they were going to be burned alive in this fiery furnace. But the king wants to give them one, so they were already refused to bow down. The king wants to give them one more chance, so he's having this conversation with them, hey, we're going to do this again. We're going to play the music, and you're going to bow down this time. And what I want to read is 3 verses of their response to this king before he plays the music again, and they have to decide whether or not they're going to bow down. So here's what happens. It's Daniel chapter 3, verse 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. He is able. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. So I love these 3 verses because these 3 verses lay out 3 separate layers of faith. Notice in the beginning of the verse, they say, hey, our God can save us from the fire furnace. And notice what they said. They said, if we get thrown in, we believe God can save us. They didn't say, hey, we believe God can prevent us from being thrown in. We believe God's going to interrupt this whole thing. No, they said, hey, if we're in the flame, We actually believe that God can save us in that moment. So this is a belief that God can do the impossible. And if you were here 2 weeks ago, we talked about this, that God can do anything. And these boys believe that. So that's their first layer. They believe that God could save them from an impossible situation, that they should be cooked alive. They're like, no, somehow God's going to save us in this. And then the second layer, they said that they expected him to. He will save us, right? There was a sense of expectation. It wasn't just a belief in God's ability. It was a belief in God's intention, right? That he is going to save us. We believe that in that flame, God's intention is he's going to save us from that. And then the third layer. But even if he doesn't, we're going to trust him. They're resolved to put their trust in God, even if he doesn't save them from the flame for whatever seconds they have left to live. The moment they hit the fire, they're going to trust God. So those are the three levels of faith. You believe that God can do something, you expect that God will do something, and then you trust him if he does not do that thing. So let me ask you, which one's hardest? Which layer of faith is hardest? Believing that God can? Maybe that's hard for you. Like we talk about these impossible things like we talked about 2 weeks ago. Maybe your brain is wired in such a way that when you see something that's impossible, you have a really hard time believing that God could move through that. Maybe that's where you're at. I've kind of gotten over that one. Like I explained to you 2 weeks ago, I kind of feel like, hey, if we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, as a Christian, then I kind of think like everything else is downhill from that point. If he can conquer death, then he can do anything. But maybe you get tripped up on the second layer, expecting that God will. You believe that God can do something, but maybe you struggle with a sense of expectation. That one can be difficult because, well, if you've ever believed that God was going to do something and then if he's not done it, it can be really hard to lean into that again, right? If your expectations have been dashed, it's really hard to put them up there again. So maybe you struggle with that one. But that last one, trust God even if he doesn't. Man, that's the hard one, isn't it? For me, that's it's 101, 201, that's 301, that's advanced level. That's the hardest kind of faith, to trust God even if he doesn't do the thing that you believe that he can do, that you expect that he will do, is enduring when God says no. And I just want to point out, I don't know what Christian circles you've been in or grew up in, but I think a lot of Christian circles like believing that God can do something and expecting that God will do something, that gets held up and celebrated. Like God can do the impossible. We believe that God can do the impossible. It gets held up. But then the trusting God, even if he doesn't, that kind of faith kind of gets shoved off to the side sometimes. And it hurts, because especially if you're in an environment where God has done some impossible things and then God doesn't do the impossible thing for you, there's like shame attached to that, right? Like, why did God do a miracle for them and not for me? Why did God do this awesome thing for them and not for me? Why is God working so obviously and just miraculously in their life and not in mine? That hurts. So I want to give you three types of faith. I want to give you 4 types of suffering that you could go through in your life. Number one is an acute kind of suffering. Acute. Something happens in the moment that is explosively painful. 10 out of 10 on the pain scale, where it just is intense. The pain and suffering that you go through, it's powerful. I would say death of a loved one is right there. That's an acute suffering. Divorce is an acute suffering. Enduring some kind of accident where the pain comes in all at once. When you lose a job, that kind of suffering that comes in all at once and it goes all the way up the scale, and you're at the point where you kind of feel like life punched you in the nose. Your eyes are watering, you're bleeding, your ears are ringing a little bit. It's disorienting, the amount of pain. It's 10 out of 10 acute. That's the first kind. Second kind of suffering I'll call chronic suffering. It may not be as high on the scale. Maybe it's a 2 or a 3 or a 4, but it just doesn't go away. You have to endure this pain day in, day out, all the time. It just doesn't go away. With every beat of your heart, there's a little bit of pain attached to it. And this can be an emotional thing. I actually think a death of a loved one can be it starts off as acute and then it turns into chronic, right? Because it just keeps hurting. It can also be like an emotional thing or a physical thing, right? Like it could be back pain. It could be a stomach thing. As you get older, my wife keeps making fun of my hip hurts lately. I'm like, okay, I'm 100 years old. But it won't go away and it's annoying. It could also be something where like you had this dream of the way your life would go and it's not going that way. And every day living not in that hurts a little bit, hurts a little bit, hurts a little bit. Chronic pain, chronic suffering, not all the way up the scale, but it just doesn't go away. Third kind of suffering. This one's not talked about very much, but some of you will really resonate with this. Third kind of suffering is loving someone who is suffering. Loving someone who's suffering. Loving someone who's hurting hurts, right? And this is one of those things where if you love someone and you have to watch them suffer, like you know this, like what you want to do, you want to be able to take that onto yourself. You want to take their suffering, and you would rather hurt than watch them hurt. But you can't do that, and you kind of feel helpless. You kind of feel like powerless to do anything about it, and you have to watch without any ability to solve the problem and just love them in that. And loving someone who's suffering is a suffering, and it doesn't get a lot of attention, right? Because if you're one of those people who's loving someone who's suffering, the person who's suffering gets a lot of attention, and they should. But you usually are the one off to the side, silently hurting because you're watching them hurt. So that one for me, that's on the list. I think loving someone who's suffering is really, really difficult. And then the fourth kind of suffering I added to this list. I don't even remember where I got the list. Fourth kind. I erased it from my memory, if you're wondering why. It's gone. Unanswered prayer. That's a special kind of suffering, unanswered prayer. And I know there's some VBS graduate out there going, God always answers prayer. Cool. Okay, awesome. Shut up. Because, yes, I know theologically that God will answer your prayers in one of three ways, right? He either says yes, or he says no, or he says wait, right? Those are the three answers. So you always get an answer. But here's my problem. I know a yes when I see one because the thing happens that I prayed for, but a no? How do you know you got a no? Do y'all get an audible thing? Does God speak to you? Because he doesn't speak to me. I don't get a no. I don't get that. And I don't, same thing with wait. I don't know. No's and waits feel like unanswered prayers. It feels like heaven is silent, doesn't it? It feels like you're walking into the throne room and the doors close and they lock from the inside and you're just kind of standing there like, okay. It feels like heaven is silent, and I think that's a special kind of suffering. When you took your thing to God, you took your heart to God and you ask for something and he says, no. Or wait a really long time. So, I want to tell you, I need to tell you about my most difficult unanswered prayer. I don't want to tell you about it. I feel like God wants me to tell you about it, so. 3 years ago, my wife was pregnant with our fourth child. And listen, when you get to 4, you're like a pro, right? Like 4 is more than most people have, so you're just so much more advanced than everyone else. And I was actually a little cocky about it. Like, y'all have 2 kids, that's cute. You don't know what it's like to have 4. I know I'm being the martyr, but we felt like we were pros. all the scariness when you're at 4, it's like, it's just all gone, right? Like when you have your first kid, it's everything so scary, and you're at every doctor's appointment asking all these questions and stuff. By the 4th one, I'm like checking Facebook while the doctor's talking because I just don't care anymore. I'm like, yeah, we'll get through this, right? People asking, do you need clothes? No, we got like trash bags full in the garage somewhere, right? Binkies, like we got some in a drawer somewhere. Does it have a little hair on it? I don't care. We're putting it in the baby's mouth. It doesn't matter. When you get to 4, you just don't care anymore. It's just, you have this, like the whole angst of the thing kind of drains out of it. And that was our mentality. Like it was easy. But early February morning, 3 years ago, my wife called me after doctor's appointment, and she said one of the worst sentences in existence. They couldn't find a heartbeat. And we were 16 weeks along. There's a 0.5% chance of a miscarriage at 16 weeks. Freaking 5. We were good. That was the thing that hurt so much because it just felt so out of nowhere. And then the next day we go to the hospital to deliver our dead son. Something you should never have to do. And like the part of it that was so hard is that I didn't put together where we were going. We were going to the same floor where we had delivered the other 3 healthy children. That's jacked up, man. Every time I've been on that floor, it's been a happy thing. Every single time. With Zeke, sometimes you go to the hospital and it's too early. So I don't know if pregnant ladies have ever had to do this. You have to walk the hallway or waddle the hallways, right? You got to waddle the hallways. For Zeke, I remember walking my wife through this hallway, holding her hand, having to stop every couple minutes because the baby's coming. And it was a happy thing. It wasn't as happy for her as it was for me, but it was happy. I remember hugging my parents in that hallway when my firstborn son was born. I remember carrying my first child, Trinity, in the car seat down that hallway, out into the big world, the first time dad, where you're just clutching this little kid as you're about to go out and do this parenting thing for the first time. It's a happy hallway. And now I'm walking down that same hallway with my wife, who's devastated that she's going to deliver a child who's not alive. And then the delivery room, where an infant cry is the sweetest sound in the world, and silence is the worst. It's the juxtaposition. It's the things that it's supposed to be life and instead it's death. It's supposed to be happy and instead it's the opposite. So before they start the process, my wife asks for an ultrasound. Because we believe in a God who can do the impossible. That's why. It was our very faith that caused us to ask for that. Believe that he can? Yeah, I believe that God can do anything. Even if they couldn't find a heartbeat a day ago, I believe they could find one now because I believe in that kind of God. He's the one who sits on the high throne of heaven. He created the entire universe. He knows how a heart works. He knows how a brain works. He knows how a body works. If he wants it to work again, he can do it. I even had an expectation that he would. So they wheeled a mobile ultrasound thing in, and I sat on an uncomfortable hospital bench. And I prayed the most passionate prayer I have ever prayed. My soul entered the throne room of heaven, and I begged God for the life of my son. And then when I opened my eyes, the nurse was shaking her head. And unwittingly playing the role of prophet, God said no. He said no. Baby Roman was born February 7th. His birthday coming after his death day. That's jacked up. Makes me want to cuss. I almost did in first service. I should have. They don't have cameras. I could have cussed. It deserves cussing. So, what I wanted to do, if you go here, if this is your church, you might remember me talking about this 3 years ago. I talked about it. I talked to my wife about it. That I was like, I think it's time to talk about it again. Both of us said no, and then yes, and then no, and then yes, because I wanted to I'll play dummy. I'll play the case study for you. I want you to hear how I'm processing this 3 years later, because this event in my life has all the kinds of suffering. It has acute suffering. That phone call punched me in the soul. A sentence cut through the air. That is the worst sentence in the world. They can't find the heartbeat. That's the worst. Chronic suffering. How do you miss somebody you've never met? You would have told me that was possible. I would have never believed you. But we do. Every Christmas feels weird now. That's weird. How do you do that? Loving someone who suffers. My wife carries this different than I do. I'm a dude. I'm slightly that she carried life inside of her, and then she carried death inside of her, and that leaves a mark, man. And try not to get too fired up saying this, but she feels the weird stigma that our society has placed on the unborn. It's our society, so it's our culture's fault. Like, she can't mourn properly because in our country, 10 fingers and 10 toes and a heartbeat doesn't make you a human. So she feels weird mourning that. Screw that. That was our child. It wasn't a clump of cells or a fetus. That was our boy. She can't even mourn it properly. And I still feel the sting of that unanswered prayer. Because I'll tell you what, sometimes believing that God can do the impossible is a hard thing to swallow. That's a hard thing to swallow. It works against itself because you think you're doing a really good job believing that God can do the impossible. But then when he says no, it makes it way harder. Way harder. So here's 3 things. I want to give you 3 things that as I've processed this and as I've walked through this, have helped me head towards anti-fragile. I don't know if I'm at that point. It depends on which moment you ask me. But I think my faith has gone in the direction of stronger. It's not a straight line. It's not some perfectly increasing thing, but I believe overall it's gone in the right direction. So here's 3 things to remember when you're suffering, whether it's acute with chronic, watching someone suffer, unanswered prayer. 3 things that you need to remember, Christian. 1, death is not normal. Death is not normal. Neither is pain, neither is suffering. We were never created to experience this stuff. Do you know that? We were never created to experience death. Never. When God created the world and he put humans on it, death was not in the plans. That was not a part of God's good plan for this earth. Death entered when sin entered. So when God designed our souls, he did not design them with death in mind. Which is why, by the way, I can kind of prove this to you. When someone experiences loss, when someone experiences tragedy, they start down those stages of grief, right? What's the first stage of grief? Anybody know? Denial. Why do you think that is? Your soul, when your soul hears that someone close to you has died, the first reaction of your soul is no. No. Right? When something horrible happens, your soul's knee-jerk reaction is no. That's because your soul doesn't understand. It wasn't designed to accept these things. Your soul's not designed for that. And then the second stage is anger, by the way. So not only, at first your soul denies it, and then your soul rages against it. Because again, your soul was not designed to experience this kind of loss. It wasn't designed to experience this kind of suffering. It was never meant to be. Death isn't normal. So Christian, if you're a Christian, you are supposed to hate death. You're supposed to hate it. You're supposed to hate suffering and pain. You're supposed to hate it. Matter of fact, man, don't you dare get used to it. I think life does tend to want to beat the hate out of us, right? Like you almost just get, right? Global pandemic, another war. No, hate it, hate it, hate it. I know, man, and if you've ever experienced tragedy or loss before, people say the stupidest things to you, don't they? Don't you just want to punch people in their stupid faces when they come up and try to comfort you? I've had people say, well, death is just a part of life. No, the frick it isn't. See, there it is again. Thank you, Larry, for keeping me from cussing. No, it isn't. It was never intended to be. Like that, death is the most unnatural thing ever. It's not supposed to be a part of life. It's not. You're supposed to hate it. I believe it's unchristian to say that sentence. Like that sentence is distinctly unchristian to say that death is just a part of, that's a different worldview. That's not our worldview. If you believe in like evolution and natural selection and that we just came from nothing and everything means nothing, sure, death is just a part of this vicious cycle and eventually the sun's going to explode and it's all going to end. We don't believe that. We believe in a God who created, and he has a plan, and that when he created us, that death did not exist, so death is not a part of life. Death is a part of something else. Sin. I don't want to normalize it. Because and that's the other thing. Maybe this is good for not just the person who's hurting, but I want to coach you through talking to people who are hurting too. Everybody takes a different amount of time to go through something. You know that, right? Like, I hope you know that. Like, there's not an appropriate, like, how long is it normal to grieve? There is no such thing. You're not supposed to, like, get better from some of this stuff. Can you imagine, best thing I could think of, can you imagine walking up to somebody whose, like, arm had gotten cut off? And you being like, hey, like, when are you going to, like, get over that? Start using your arm again. Like, it's gone, dude. It's gone. Like, I might not bleed anymore, but there's still something missing, right? And it's always going to be weird for me that it's not there anymore, right? That's the best thing I could think of when it comes to, like, loss and pain. Like, stop treating people like their arm's supposed to grow back. Like, it's not going to. It's always going to feel like something's missing. It's never going to be normal for them ever. And I would say it's not supposed to be. And what I was trying to process this morning as I was thinking, just mulling this over in my head, like people act like there's a healthy way to process this. Healthy according to what? There's no healthy way to lose an arm. Like, we hope it doesn't infect me and kill me, I guess. Is that healthy? It hurts. It's not normal. It's not normal. Rage against it. That's my first point. Hate death, Christian. Hate it. Hate it. Rage against it. You're supposed to. 2, can't spend any more time on that. Second thing you need to remember. Remember eternity. Remember eternity. This is important for me because if I don't remember eternity, I'm all kinds of logical. I am my own worst enemy sometimes. If I believe in an all-loving, all-powerful God, I have a real hard time, like with the math equation in my head, of pain and suffering and loss. I have a real hard time with it. Until I add eternity in, and then some stuff starts to make sense. I'm not saying it makes all the sense, but if I have to remember eternity. Because some of you, you're like me, in your pain, in your suffering, you're asking that question like, how could God let this happen? Right? He's loving. He's powerful. He didn't do anything. Why? And like that question doesn't make sense. You can't think, it's like a math equation that like doesn't balance out. You're like, it doesn't make any sense. But you have to factor in eternity. Eternity is a really long time. The first day is like 10,000 years. The first minute, right? Like it's forever. And what pain and suffering you are feeling in this moment feels big and overwhelming and too much. But if you put it in light of eternity, it shrinks real quick. Your suffering is like a raindrop falling into the ocean of eternity, like a pebble rolling down a granite mountain, like a grain of sand blowing around the Sahara, like that dim light bulb in your garage compared to all the stars in the sky. Eternity. God has eternity to wipe those tears from your eyes. Eternity. God has eternity to explain his grand plan to you. You have to think that God is so big and so wise, and his plan has to be bigger than we can understand. If God's plan was small enough for us to understand, he wouldn't be God, right? I have to understand that my lifetime is this, and God's plan has like a long arc to it that's not going to land inside of my lifetime. That the conclusion of whatever it is he's doing, I'm just a part of the messy middle here. I haven't seen the end yet. It's going to land somewhere in eternity. And that's what I keep reminding myself that, and you have to think about this, like 1,000 years from now. 1,000 years from now, I'm going to sit somewhere with my son, if we still have those kind of relationships with heaven. I don't know if I'll still call him son at that point. 1,000, we're each 1,000 and something years old at that point. But I'll ask Roman, hey, I remember when you died? And he's going to be like, no. Turn to Lisa, remember when Roman died? Kinda. I mean, that's so long ago. Like, you really have to have that perspective that eternity is so long that this pain is going to shrink real fast in the rear view mirror of eternity. That God's doing something way bigger than you see. So for me, this is helpful. Eternity is helpful because when God says no, I remember eternity. That this ark is going to land way out there. He's not in a hurry for things to make sense in my lifetime. He's just bigger than that. So that's the second thing. 1, remember death is not normal. 2, remember eternity. 3, remember the cross and the empty tomb. The cross and the empty tomb. I think one of the mistakes we make when we're in pain is that we think of God as being like this detached, mighty, up on his throne, kind of stoic figure, and we're down here in the mess. Like that's the mental image that some of us have, that God is up in his ivory tower, all emotionless and sitting there, and we're down here falling apart. But that's not like the God we serve. That's not. God, the God we serve, the Christian God came down into this mess. He did not create this world and then back away from it. When sin entered the world and this whole thing went sideways, he decided, I'm going to come down. He entered into the pain and the suffering. God knows what it's like to hurt. Not like knows like read it in a textbook. Knows on an experiential level what it's like to hurt. We have a God who suffers. That should mean something. That should move you a little bit, that God knows what it's like. He is not detached from this. He has empathy in your situation. I mean, think about it. Specifically, Jesus, he prayed a prayer that God said no to. He actually prayed the king of unanswered prayers. You realize that? The night he was betrayed and murdered, he prayed, Lord, take this cup from me. God said no. He knows what that's like. I mean, it says that he was sweating drops of blood, that he was pouring his soul out. God said no. He knows what acute pain feels like on the cross. He knows what chronic pain, he knows all of these. He knows what it's like to love someone who's suffering. He knows all of these intimately. We do not have a God who's detached from this stuff. But Jesus, he knew that God's plan was bigger than the pain he was going to endure. That the sorrow and the pain of the cross was going to be transformed into the joy and victory of the empty tomb. He knew God was going to do something with it. That from the cross, God screams that he understands what pain and sorrow are like in this world. And the empty tomb screams that it's not always going to be this way, which is what your soul longs for. The empty tomb is a promise of a future with no more death or pain or sorrow. Jesus died for the sins of the world to reconcile us to God through faith and to begin the undoing of this evil in this world. So when God says no, you got to realize it's not some callous king making some decree from the high heavens like, no. No, man. He's a loving father who says no because the plan is bigger than we could possibly imagine. When I was sitting on that hospital bench pleading with him, he was next to me. He wasn't up there far away. He was with me. Saying, hey, I'm not saying yes to that. But he still loves me. And that's the thing. This is the thing that got me as I thought, I felt like I preached a sermon 2 weeks ago about how God could do the impossible. And that's really important. I want to be a church that believes that God can do the impossible. But here's what I got worried about. Because believing that God can and will do something is a trust in his ability, right? Believe that you trust in his ability. But trusting God if he doesn't, that's trusting his heart, right? Those are two kind of distinct things, right? I can trust God's ability, but I also need to trust his heart. And here's what I worry about. I don't want this for you. I don't want this for our church. I don't want this for me. If your faith is increasing on believing that God can do something, but your trusting in his heart doesn't grow, you know what happens to a person who has this kind of thing going on in their heart? I believe that God can. I expect that he will. But my trusting in his heart doesn't grow. You know, it lives right here between these two. Bitterness, anger, rage at God. The more you believe that he can do the impossible, if your trusting in his heart doesn't grow, that's actually going to come back to bite you. We need these both to grow at the same pace. I believe that he can, I expect that he will, and I trust him if he doesn't. This is the only way this works. We gotta have both. So I gotta ask. I asked you, do you believe in the impossible 2 weeks ago? Now I'll ask, do you trust his heart? Do you trust God's heart? I think that's harder. By the way, side note, this was Jonah's problem in the whole story of Jonah. Jonah believed that God could do things. Jonah expected God to do things. Jonah didn't trust God's heart. That's the lesson of Jonah. And it's the key. It's the key to becoming anti-fragile in your faith, to trusting God's heart. If you trust God's heart, even when he says no, the winds of your life will not blow out the candle of your faith. It'll make it hotter. So I want to leave you with this. Worship team, you guys can come back up here. Do you know that God keeps our tears and our prayers, both those things? The Bible actually says that he keeps your tears and he keeps your prayers. He keeps them. Book of Revelation actually talks about him even using them. Every tear you've ever cried, every prayer you've ever prayed, it didn't just go off into the ether and disappear. He treasures them. And then I want to read one more thing. It is our Christian hope. At the end of the last book of the Bible, Revelation chapter 21, 3 and 4 says this. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, from the throne, that means this is the high king, this is God, speaking in a loud voice, so pay attention. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. The former things have passed away. The former things have passed away. I love that little line, the former things. The former things are what we're living in now. That's sorrow. Sorrow is a former thing. Pain is a former thing. Death is a former thing. They're passing away. And when God comes to make all things new, those things aren't going to exist anymore. And that's our Christian hope. So here's what we're going to do. The worship team is going to play. We're going to have some people come up to the sides, on either side, ready to pray with you if you need prayer. And I just want to encourage you, if you're carrying something, if you've got a hurt, if you've got a pain, if you've been suffering, I want to encourage you to come up and have somebody pray with you. That would be it's the fourth thing that I didn't include in this sermon because I'm already over. A community of people around you will help you get through this. Having other people to be there to lean on is an essential part of your faith getting stronger in suffering. So there'll be some people available. But I would also encourage you just right where you are to ask God to help you trust his heart, to believe that he has your best interest at heart, to believe that he has a plan that's bigger than you, and to not just believe that he can, but to trust him if he doesn't. Stand up and pray with me. Jesus, I pray for the person right now who's hurting. I pray for the person right now who still has that taste in their mouth from an unanswered prayer. That sting of loss, Lord. That ache in their heart. Help them to press into you, to not run away from you in that, but to you in that. To not push away from you like you're the cause of it, like you're callous to it, Lord, but to run to you like a loving father, like a child who hurt himself would run to a kid. Lord, I pray that would be our heart, to run to you in these things. To take our pain, to take our hurt to you, and to know that you hate it too, and that your plan is so much bigger. Help us to trust your heart, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.